Welcome to Historical Pulse, the channel where history doesn't just live in books. It moves, breathes, and reshapes the world we know. Imagine living in a world where your very existence is owned by someone else, where your body, your labor, your children, and your future can be bought, sold, or destroyed at will. Now imagine not only escaping that world, but returning to it again and again, risking capture, torture, and death, not for fame, not for reward, but for freedom. Imagine leading dozens of people through darkness, swamps, forests, and enemy territory, guided only by faith, courage, and an unbreakable will. This is the story of Harriet Tubman, not just a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but a freedom fighter, military strategist, nurse, spy, abolitionist, and visionary whose life reshaped the meaning of courage in American history. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery around 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland. Her birth name was Araminta Ross, though she was later called Minty by family and friends. Her parents, Harriet Ritgreen and Ben Ross, were enslaved by different owners, a common practice that fractured black families and ensured constant emotional instability. From her earliest years, Harriet lived with the reality that family bonds could be shattered at any moment by sale or transfer. The plantation economy of Maryland in the early 19th century was built on human bondage, violence, and fear. Enslaved people were not considered citizens or even full human beings under the law. They were property, assets to be worked, traded, and punished at will. Harriet grew up watching relatives disappear, hearing cries of pain from beatings, and witnessing the systematic destruction of dignity that defined slavery. As a child, Harriet was hired out to different households, forced into domestic labor and field work at a young age. One of her earliest assignments involved checking muskrat traps in icy waters, a task that left her chronically ill and vulnerable to cold exposure. In another position, she was assigned to care for an infant and whipped whenever the baby cried. She later recalled these moments as some of the most painful of her life, not only because of physical suffering, but because of the deep injustice of being punished for circumstances beyond her control. The defining moment of her early life came when she was still a teenager. While working in a dry goods store, Harriet encountered an enslaved man attempting to escape from his overseer. The overseer demanded Harriet help restrain him. She refused. In response, the overseer threw a heavy metal weight intended for the fleeing man, but it struck Harriet instead, crushing her skull. The injury nearly killed her. She was unconscious for days and bedridden for weeks, and afterward suffered lifelong consequences: severe headaches, seizures, sudden sleep episodes, and vivid visions. Yet rather than weakening her spirit, the injury became a source of deep religious conviction. Harriet believed God had spared her for a purpose. She began experiencing powerful spiritual visions and developed an unshakable faith that would guide her throughout her life. Despite her injury, Harriet returned to labor. She grew stronger physically and mentally, becoming known for her resilience, work ethic, and refusal to surrender inwardly to enslavement. But the psychological scars of slavery and the ever-present threat of sale continued to weigh heavily on her. In the 1840s, Harriet married a free black man named John Tubman. From this marriage, she adopted the surname Tubman and later changed her first name from Araminta to Harriet, likely in honor of her mother. Yet marriage did not shield her from bondage. Under American law, children inherited the enslaved status of their mother, meaning Harriet's potential children would automatically be born into slavery, a reality that haunted her. As the 1840s progressed, the threat of sale loomed increasingly close. After the death of her enslaver in 1849, Harriet learned she might soon be sold to plantations in the Deep South, a fate often considered a death sentence by enslaved people due to harsher conditions and near-total loss of hope for freedom. Faced with this terrifying prospect, Harriet made a life-altering decision. She would run. In 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped slavery alone, traveling roughly 90 miles north from Maryland to Pennsylvania, a free state, using secret routes, safe houses, and the assistance of abolitionist networks that would later become known as the Underground Railroad. She traveled by night, hid during the day, navigated forests and waterways, and relied on coded signals and the kindness of strangers who risked severe punishment for helping fugitives. When she finally crossed into free territory, Harriet later said, "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person." There was such a glory over everything, yet her joy was incomplete. Her family remained enslaved. Her people remained enslaved. And freedom, she believed, meant nothing if it belonged only to her. Most people who escaped slavery never returned. The risk was simply too great. Under federal law, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, escaped enslaved people could be captured even in free states and forcibly returned to bondage. Anyone who aided fugitives faced fines, imprisonment, or worse. Bounty hunters roamed northern cities. Kidnappings were common. Yet Harriet Tubman did what few dared. She went back. In 1850, just 1 year after her escape, Harriet returned to Maryland and helped her niece and her niece's children flee to freedom. That first rescue marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary missions of resistance in modern history. Over the next decade, Harriet made approximately 13 known missions into slave territory and personally guided around 70 people to freedom, including her parents, siblings, and many others. Dozens more escaped using routes and instructions she provided. She became known among enslaved communities as Moses, a reference to the biblical figure who led the Israelites out of bondage. Her reputation spread quietly but powerfully. Enslaved people whispered about a woman who came at night, who knew the roads and rivers, who carried a pistol, not for violence but for protection, and sometimes to deter anyone tempted to turn back and risk betraying the group. Harriet's missions were incredibly dangerous. Slave catchers advertised large rewards for her capture. Armed patrols hunted fugitives relentlessly. The terrain itself, swamps, forests, rivers, mountains, posed constant threats. Harriet often traveled in winter, when nights were longer and patrols less active, but conditions were brutal. She guided children, elders, and injured people through freezing temperatures, hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Yet she never lost a passenger, not one. Her success was not accidental. Harriet was meticulous, disciplined, and strategic. She memorized routes, monitored patrol schedules, used disguises, and employed coded songs and signals to communicate danger or safety. She trusted few people, but formed deep alliances with abolitionists like William Still, Frederick Douglass, Thomas Garrett, and members of interracial Underground Railroad networks. Frederick Douglass later wrote of her, "Excepting John Brown, of sacred memory, I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than Harriet Tubman." Harriet herself attributed her success not to strategy alone, but to God. She prayed constantly, before journeys, during danger, and in moments of despair. She believed divine guidance warned her of threats, showed her which paths to take, and protected her from capture. Whether viewed through religious faith or historical analysis, her confidence and calm under pressure were remarkable. Her courage was not reckless, it was disciplined, calculated, and deeply purposeful. As the 1850s unfolded, the nation grew increasingly divided over slavery. Fugitive slave laws grew harsher. Violence escalated in places like Kansas and the halls of Congress. Abolitionists debated strategy, moral persuasion, political reform, or armed resistance. Harriet Tubman found herself increasingly connected to radical anti-slavery networks that believed slavery could not be dismantled without force. One of her closest allies during this period was John Brown, the militant abolitionist who planned an armed uprising at Harper's Ferry in 1859. Harriet assisted Brown in recruiting supporters and gathering intelligence, and he referred to her as General Tubman. Although illness prevented her from joining the raid itself, she believed deeply in Brown's cause and mourned his execution as the loss of a righteous warrior against injustice. Yet Harriet's activism extended far beyond clandestine rescues. She became a public speaker for abolition, sharing her story at rallies across the North to raise funds and awareness. Despite limited formal education and lifelong neurological complications from her head injury, she spoke with clarity, authority, and emotional power. Audiences were stunned not only by her experiences, but by her composure and moral strength. She also worked closely with leading abolitionists, including Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, and members of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Her life bridged grassroots resistance and organized political activism, a rare combination that gave her influence across multiple spheres of the movement. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, Harriet Tubman saw it not simply as a political conflict, but as a divine reckoning, a war that could finally end slavery. She immediately offered her services to the Union Army. Though women, especially black women, were excluded from formal military positions, Harriet became deeply involved in Union operations in South Carolina, particularly in areas along the coast and rivers where enslaved people were fleeing plantations in large numbers. She began working as a nurse, caring for wounded soldiers and formerly enslaved refugees known as contrabands. She used herbal remedies and traditional healing knowledge to treat smallpox, dysentery, and other deadly diseases when medical supplies were scarce. Many soldiers credited her with saving their lives. But Harriet's role soon expanded beyond caregiving. Because of her deep familiarity with Southern terrain, secret routes, and slave networks, Harriet became a scout and spy for the Union Army, one of the first women in American history to serve in such a capacity. She gathered intelligence behind Confederate lines, mapped rivers and supply routes, and built networks of informants among enslaved communities. Her most famous military operation came on June 2, 1863, during the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina. Working alongside Colonel James Montgomery, Harriet helped lead a Union gunboat expedition up the Combahee River to destroy Confederate supply depots, rice mills, and plantations, and to liberate enslaved people in the region. As Union boats approached, Harriet and her scouts had already spread word among enslaved communities. Hundreds of people fled plantations and ran toward the riverbanks, boarding Union ships under Confederate fire. In a single night, more than 700 enslaved people were freed, one of the largest liberation actions of the Civil War. Harriet Tubman became the first woman in U.S. history to plan and lead a military raid. Yet despite this extraordinary service, she received no official military rank, no regular salary, and no formal recognition at the time. Like many black veterans and women contributors, her service went largely unacknowledged by the federal government for decades. After the Civil War ended in 1865 and slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment, Harriet hoped for a new era of justice and equality. But freedom did not bring security or prosperity for millions of formerly enslaved people. The Reconstruction period, though filled with promise, was marked by violent backlash, economic exploitation, and the rise of segregationist systems that would soon become known as Jim Crow. Harriet Tubman returned to Auburn, New York, where she had purchased land years earlier with the help of abolitionist allies. There, she reunited with her elderly parents, whom she had rescued from slavery and brought north years before. She built a home and took in relatives, orphans, elderly people, and anyone in need of shelter. Her house became a refuge, much like the safe houses she had once relied upon during Underground Railroad missions. Despite her fame, Harriet lived in persistent poverty. She struggled financially for most of her life, relying on donations from supporters and modest earnings from public speaking. The federal government denied her military pension for decades, despite her service during the Civil War. When she finally received a pension in 1899, it was granted not for her own work, but as the widow of her second husband, Nelson Davis, a Union Army veteran whom she married in 1869. Nelson Davis was much younger than Harriet, and their marriage was described by friends as deeply loving and supportive. Together, they adopted a daughter named Gertie and continued Harriet's lifelong commitment to caring for others. But Harriet's activism did not end with slavery. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, she became increasingly involved in the women's suffrage movement, advocating for the right of women to vote. She worked alongside figures like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, bringing the voices of black women into a movement that often marginalized them. Harriet argued that freedom meant not only emancipation from slavery, but political power, dignity, and full citizenship for all. She also spoke out against racial segregation, lynching, and economic injustice. Though she lacked wealth and formal education, she possessed something far more powerful: moral authority. Her life experience gave her credibility that no institution could grant. In 1896, Harriet purchased additional land in Auburn to establish the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, a residence for elderly and poor black Americans who had nowhere else to go. When financial difficulties threatened the project, she personally moved into the home and eventually turned the property over to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, ensuring it would continue serving the community after her death. By the early 1900s, Harriet's health began to decline. The head injury she suffered as a teenager continued to cause severe pain, seizures, and neurological symptoms throughout her life. She underwent brain surgery in the 1890s without anesthesia in an attempt to relieve pressure and pain, an ordeal that would have broken most people, but which Harriet endured with her characteristic faith and resilience. Despite these hardships, she remained active as long as her strength allowed, speaking, organizing, praying, and mentoring younger generations. She believed deeply that her life had meaning beyond her own survival, that God had preserved her to serve others. On March 10, 1913, Harriet Tubman died peacefully at the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, surrounded by family and loved ones. She was approximately 91 years old. She was buried with military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York, a rare recognition for a woman, and rarer still for a black woman who had been born enslaved. But Harriet Tubman's death did not mark the end of her influence. In many ways, it marked the beginning of her transformation into a global symbol of resistance, freedom, and moral courage. To understand Harriet Tubman fully, one must look beyond the heroic myths and recognize the complexity of her life. She was not a flawless figure carved from legend. She was human, vulnerable, sometimes ill, often poor, frequently afraid. Yet she chose action over safety, responsibility over comfort, and justice over survival. Her story challenges modern assumptions about power. She had no formal authority, no wealth, no weapons of mass influence, no institutional backing, yet she reshaped history. She disrupted one of the most brutal economic systems in human civilization, not through armies or laws, but through persistence, strategy, faith, and unyielding resolve. She also redefined the meaning of leadership. Harriet did not seek fame or command. She did not publish manifestos or occupy offices. Her leadership was relational, situational, and moral, rooted in trust, shared risk, and unwavering commitment to others' freedom. She led from within the struggle, not above it. Her life also forces us to reconsider how freedom is achieved. The end of slavery was not the product of a single law, a single war, or a single leader. It was the result of countless acts of resistance, some loud, some silent, carried out by enslaved people themselves. Harriet Tubman embodied that resistance. She did not wait for freedom to be granted. She seized it and then returned to help others seize it too. In doing so, she shattered one of the most dangerous myths of oppression, the myth of helplessness. Harriet proved that even under the most violent and dehumanizing systems, agency persists, choice persists, courage persists. Her story also complicates simplistic narratives of American freedom. The United States often celebrates itself as a land of liberty, yet Harriet's life exposes how fiercely freedom had to be fought for, how brutally it was denied, and how long its promises remained unfulfilled. Her journey from bondage to liberation, from enslaved girl to military leader, from fugitive to national icon, reflects the nation's deepest contradictions and its highest possibilities. Perhaps most powerfully, Harriet Tubman's life speaks across generations. Her courage resonates with civil rights activists, freedom fighters, women's rights advocates, and anyone confronting injustice, whether racial, political, economic, or social. She reminds us that justice is not inevitable. It is built, often at great cost, by those willing to stand in its defense. She also reminds us that resistance does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like guidance through darkness. Sometimes it looks like patience, planning, and protection. Sometimes it looks like returning again and again into danger, not because one is fearless, but because others need freedom more than one needs safety. Harriet once said she had two guiding principles in life. I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. Those words were not rhetoric, they were lived reality. And yet, despite the gravity of her struggle, Harriet Tubman was not defined by bitterness. Those who knew her described her as joyful, humorous, deeply spiritual, and compassionate. She sang hymns. She prayed constantly. She welcomed strangers into her home. She laughed easily. She carried pain, but she did not let it harden her heart. Her strength was not built on hatred of her oppressors. It was built on love for the oppressed. That distinction matters because Harriet Tubman did not fight merely to escape slavery. She fought to affirm humanity. She believed freedom was not simply the absence of chains, but the presence of dignity, agency, and belonging. She did not rescue people to make herself heroic. She did so because freedom, in her eyes, was a divine right. In the centuries since her birth, Harriet Tubman's story has been told in classrooms, books, films, songs, monuments, and museums. Yet no retelling can fully capture the magnitude of what she accomplished or the inner strength required to do it. She lived at the intersection of race, gender, class, disability, and faith, facing layered oppression. Yet she rose not only to survive, but to lead. She changed how history remembers enslaved women, not as passive victims, but as agents of resistance. She changed how leadership is defined, not by rank or title, but by sacrifice and service. She changed how courage is understood, not as fearlessness, but as faith in action. And perhaps most importantly, she changed how freedom itself is imagined, not as a gift bestowed by power, but as a right claimed by the courageous. Welcome to Historical Pulse, where stories of resilience, justice, and human courage remind us that history is not just about what happened, it's about what is possible. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.